Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, we haven't visited the channel Mitsi Studio for a little while. They have some pretty cool and unique animations, a unique way of taking a look at history. So we're going to take a look today at their video 11 Most Brutal Torture Methods, a little light history for your afternoon. So this should be an interesting one to take a look at. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary, as well as Mitsi Studio's other fantastic content. We will definitely be looking at more of them in the future. Hey, I want to give it a shout out and a thank you to Sven in Trondheim, Norway. I don't know much about Trondheim. I know that is the scene of one of the bombing raids that they go on in the show Masters of the Air, the subpens there. So Norway definitely on my bucket list of places I'd like to get to in the next couple of years. So hopefully Sven will get the chance to meet if I ever do get to that part of Norway. So thank you, Sven, for your support on Patreon. Couldn't do it without you. Let's dive into this one. Oh, I see the Brazen Ball has made an appearance. We're definitely going to be talking about that one.
Sound torture. Archaeological evidence suggests torture was prevalent about 7,000 years ago in early Neolithic Europe, although people were probably being cruel and torture-frenzy for a while longer.
So literally before we even had written records in history, before history even existed, we have torture.
Despite torture still being practiced across the world, most Western countries don't use it anymore. For example, the US hasn't used torture since Guantanamo Bay. That place became infamous for using loudspeakers to blast heavy metal music in a small room with a prisoner. Very cruel. Except for that one prisoner who was actually a fan of heavy metal. This torture technique is often combined with long-term isolation and is used to cause severe stress on a prisoner's mental state.
So it's interesting to me as we think about this, and I'm not here to pass judgment one way or the other on the efficacy of torture or on even the reliability of torture as a way to get what one wants from someone if you're torturing for information, for example. But I do find it interesting that there seems to be a defining line for some people between psychological torture and physical torture. Some people think that physical torture, like if you're inflicting bodily harm on someone, is not okay, but that psychological torture somehow is different, that it doesn't cross the same line. Because to me, just as we talk about mental health and the importance that mental health is every bit as important as health for other parts of the body, and that the brain can get sick too, it seems to me that psychological torture is physical torture if you kind of look at it that way.
Lingchi.
I don't know this one.
Lingchi translates to various names like slow process, lingering death, slow slicing, or death by a thousand cuts.
Death by a thousand cuts. Okay, I didn't know the Chinese name for it, but now it makes sense.
Not a convenient death if you were in a rush. This torture method was part of an execution process used in China around 900 AD. It was also used in Vietnam and Korea. The method was adopted to punish people who committed heinous crimes. In most cases, the condemned person would be strapped to a beam or pole. Subsequently, a knife was used to cut small portions of skin or small body parts.
Yeah, so, I mentioned a few minutes ago about torture as a method for extracting information or getting something, but I think for most of human history, torture seems to be used more as a punishment than as an attempt to extract information.
Vital organs or veins were bypassed to make sure the victim would not die prematurely. According to Chinese beliefs, the execution was also a punishment after death, because the body would not transit whole to the spiritual life.
Interesting.
If you think about it, the not transitioning to spiritual stuff part might be the least concerning thing on your mind.
I don't know, though, because if you're in a situation, granted, I've never been in that situation, so I'm really just speculating here. I feel like if you're in that situation and you do believe in there being an afterlife, at that point, knowing that this process ends with your death, you're kind of hoping for the afterlife to come as quickly as possible. So the psychological torture of we're not only killing your body, but we're also killing your afterlife, I feel like would be a big deal for folks.
If you were unlucky, the execution could last several days.
Yeah, and he said that this was 900 AD or something, but I've read, and I think I've even seen photographs of examples of this being done as recently as the early 20th century.
And opium could be given to alleviate the suffering. Do you think shopping feels like torture on its own?
Yes.
Visit our Mitsi store and get some cool Mitsi merch today. We have tons of different things, like this big willy on a shirt, a little willy on a little shirt.
I love it.
A pickle halber on your phone. Oh, almost forgot. We also have normal stuff, so take your pick. If this promo didn't make you depressed yet, go to mitsistore.com and order now. Or keep watching the video. I mean, who cares? Iron Maiden.
This didn't exist. It's not real.
For the introduction of this next device, we go back to the 19th century. Although some historians have argued that the device did not actually exist.
It didn't.
But for the sake of this video, we believe that it did.
So, okay, fair enough. It's going to be fun to talk about, but let's just be clear. There is no historical evidence that the Iron Maiden was something that was ever used for torture.
The Iron Maiden is a human-sized casket made from wood and iron spikes. The casket was made of multiple pieces that could be opened to allow a person to enter. The shape of the casket forced the new resident to stand upright for a long time. To make matters worse, the iron spikes would pierce the body of the poor chap inside. The length of the spikes was long enough to pierce the skin and flesh, but were too short to reach any organs or other vital parts. Obviously, this was done to make sure the victim would suffer during their stay, but not necessarily die a quick death. Kind of like staying in a Park Plaza hotel. Keel
this
hauling.
one's brutal. It's the
name
Dutch.
keel hauling comes from the Dutch word keelhalen. The invention of keel hauling was basically the result of being on a ship combined with Dutch ingenuity to come up with creative punishments with limited resources.
Let me just observe for a second that they've got like 3 different Dutch flags going on here. You've got the red, white, and blue one, the orange, white, and blue one, and then the all-orange one.
The far-stretching Dutch-Asian trading routes had ships sailing the world seas for many months on end. Many cases of misconduct or mutiny broke out on these ships. To crack down on these revolts, captains enforced severe punishments on the agitators. With keel hauling, a long rope dragged the sailor under the hull of the ship. This method could play out in many ways. However, most outcomes were somewhere between bad and very bad. If it was bad, the sailor would be dragged along the hull, which was usually covered in barnacles. These would cause painful lacerations. If the outcome was very bad, the sailor could die from head trauma, hitting the rocking hull, or simply but obviously drowning, which is the worst nightmare for every Dutch person.
The worst nightmare for every Dutch person. I think it's the worst nightmare for a lot of people, period. But so one of the things that's, I think, very unique about Mitsi Studios' animation being kind of cartoonish is that it allows them to portray some of this stuff more graphically than we might otherwise get to see. So hopefully this doesn't get demonetized.
Rat torture. Most people are not a fan of rats, and this next torture method is not going to change that. The most famous variant is the bucket rat torture, originating from the Tower of London's Rats Dungeon in the Elizabethan era. A dark cell near the high water mark would draw in rats from the River Thames. The rats started to eat on the limbs of the prisoners while they were...
So when they talk about the high water mark, so the Thames from London leads directly to the ocean, and so during high and low tide, there's actually kind of a going up and going down of the river, which is not something you see in every river. But in this case, because it kind of backwashes from the ocean, you get that. And so the Tower of London being right there on the river, as most buildings of some historical importance at that time were. All the palaces were on rivers and things like that. Not all, but most. And because it was easy to transport that way. So the Trader's Gate, which is the famous gate that you could access by boat was right there on the river.
Were still alive, and not a very pleasant experience. During the Dutch Revolt, a pottery bowl filled with rats was placed upside down on the naked body of a prisoner. Hot charcoal was piled on the bowl, making the rats inside the bowl panic. Desperate to escape the heat, the rats would eat their way into the bowels of the victim. This process would be quite horrifying and extremely painful.
I'm trying to imagine who the person was that came up with this and said, you know what, I've got a great idea, and then somebody signed off on it and they did it. This one to me, and I've heard of it before because I think we did another video where this particular topic was covered. About one of the worst ones I can imagine.
Making the victim die a slow death. Later, several South American dictatorships followed up on the rat torture, with Argentina refining the method to something called a rectoscope, with rats being inserted into a tube so the rats could gnaw their way into a victim's rectum. Elaborating on the expression, not giving a rat's ass. Crucifixion.
Yeah, this one's bad.
Crucifixion. A bad thing if you're not into slow deaths, but great if you're trying to promote a religion. Crucifixion was a method of capital punishment, where the victim was tied or nailed to a wooden beam or cross. The victims would be left hanging until they bled to death, or just with the passing of time and not being able to run to a supermarket.
All right, so I got to disagree with them on this one. It was never about bleeding to death, because if you were going to bleed to death, it wasn't going to happen from from nails in your hands or in your wrists or your feet that miss all the major arteries. Your body would deal with that long before you ever bled to death. The point of crucifixion was not bleeding to death; it was suffocation. They would nail your body to the cross, or even tie it if they tied the arms, in such a way that your knees were slightly bent, and so you could breathe in, but you couldn't breathe out in that position because of the way that things kind of push down on your diaphragm. You had to straighten your legs out to be able to breathe out and take the next breath. And so you're pushing on that nail through your feet to be able to push up and get putting all of your weight on that nail in order to breathe out. And eventually you're getting so weak, sometimes it takes days, to where you can't do that anymore, and you would eventually suffocate, or your heart, the fluid would kind of surround your heart, which we see that described in the Gospels. So that's why when you read in the Gospel account, they talk about the soldiers coming around to break the legs of the guys on the cross, because that's what they would do to hurry death. Because once your legs are broken, you can't push up anymore, and you would very quickly suffocate after that. I think it's called a Crucifixion or something like that. Let me look this up. All right, so here's the word here. It's Crucifixion, and it comes from the Latin for leg and fracture, and it literally means to break the legs, the lower leg bones, as an ancient form of punishment, and this would often be done as part of crucifixion in order to hurry up the process of death.
This method of capital punishment was used by the Persians, Carthaginians, and Romans.
Yeah, the Romans, like they did with a lot of things, they adopted things that they learned from cultures that they conquered or came in contact with. And this was used as a form of capital punishment, particularly for acts of against the government. It was a way of discouraging acts of what they considered treason.
During Emperor Titus's invasion of Jerusalem, many Jews were nailed to crosses.
Oh, and during the revolt of Spartacus, there were 6,000 crucifixions along the roads leading in and out of the cities in that area where the rebellion happened.
This was done by Jew-hunting Roman soldiers, including Mel Gibson. As mentioned before, victims could be hanged for days or exposed to the environment and being eaten by vultures. It is believed the most common cause of death during crucifixion was asphyxiation,
there you go,
with the condemned having serious trouble inhaling due to the hyperextension of the chest. The most famous crucifixion is, of course, the one where they hung Jesus.
And like I said, it was actually exhaling that they couldn't do, not inhaling.
Died on the cross for our sins and promised he would come back for a visit. Didn't happen yet, still waiting. White room torture. No, not the new clubhouse name of the Proud Boys, but a torture technique using a small cell completely painted white. The effect on the prisoner's mental state would be significant over time. The prisoner would wear white clothing, eat white rice, and drink white milk. With the complete numbing of the senses, the prisoners would experience severe mental stress paired with hallucinations. This torture technique works extremely well for interrogations and is believed to be used in Iranian prisons and by the CIA.
Really?
The Iranian regime shrugs this off by being totalitarian, obviously. The US
I've literally never heard of this one. This is kind of fascinating.
just calls it enhanced interrogation instead of torture. It seems both excuses work really well.
Oh,
Scaphism.
this one's brutal too.
Floating on water in a little boat sounds relaxing, right? Well, wrong. We are talking about scaphism here, an ancient Persian method of execution and probably one of the nastiest on our list.
And definitely one of those ones that was meant as a severe deterrent to this sort of crime.
Before the whole boat floating stuff, you are fed honey and milk. Thereafter, you are strapped between two boats with your limbs hanging out. Next, you just get a small push, and there you are, floating on water filled with swarms of hungry vermin. With uncontrollable diarrhea, do you want to see this anus? Join our Patreon for uncensored videos.
Do you want to see this anus? No, I do not want to see the uncensored version of that.
Now, let's move on. It wouldn't take long for the vermin to find their way inside the boat and start eating the passenger's body from the inside out. Yikes.
Awful, awful stuff.
The Brazen Ball. The Brazen Bull, also known as the Bronze Bull, Sicilian Bull, or Bull of Phalaris, was an ancient Greek torture device designed in the shape of a bull, obviously. With one door on the side, the condemned was placed inside of it. A fire was set under the bull, heating up the metal structure, frying the victim inside. To make the whole process a true cinematic display, an acoustic apparatus inside the device converted the screams of the condemned into the sound of an infuriated beast. The inventor of the device, Phalaris, was later overthrown by Telemachus. Phalaris suddenly found himself locked inside his own designed bull of...
I was going to say, this is one of those unique stories where the inventor of the thing ends up dying by the thing. I've actually heard versions of the story where he was asked to come up with this method of execution, and then when he invented it, it was tested on him. I don't know if that's true or not, if that's one of those apocryphal stories. But there are other examples of people ending up victims of their own form of punishment. Obviously, the man Robespierre was not the man who invented the guillotine, but Robespierre in revolutionary France was the man most responsible for sending people to the guillotine and ended up dying by it himself.
Phalaris, now literally. He would never hear his own screaming, just the sound of an infuriated bull. Bamboo torture.
Yeah.
Bamboo torture, a kind of vegan colonoscopy, is a torture method that doesn't need many resources. The victim would be tied in a fixed position, overhanging one or multiple bamboo shoots. There are depictions of victims hanging in a horizontal position. A slower torture method is where the victim is hanging vertically. The bamboo shoot would grow up the victim's arse into his intestines. At this stage, the victim would probably still be alive, but wishing he wasn't.
I mean, you're talking about, bamboo grows pretty fast, but you're still talking about days and days, if not weeks, of this.
With a growing speed of roughly a few centimeters an hour, the bamboo would slowly pierce the upper torso, eventually killing the victim. Since the body is hanging on a stick, bamboo torture is ideal for cannibalism parties. Blood Eagle.
This is another one of those ones that there are stories from medieval England of this being done, for example, to Ayala, but again, we're not entirely 100% sure of the nature of this and whether it happened as often as it's portrayed.
The blood eagle is a torture technique that appears in Norse literature. A bunch of Vikings thought it would be a cool sight to chop open a man's back, sever his ribs from his spine, and pull their lungs through the gaping hole. The graphic resemblance to a bird shape gave this method the name blood eagle. Despite its appearance in Norse literature, there is no archaeological evidence to prove this method was adopted.
This is a great example, though. You might not find any archaeological evidence, but it's important for us when we're studying history to remember that absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. In other words, just because we haven't found archaeological evidence of something doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And a lot of times we find it later, like, even in the last few decades, certain things have been discovered that hadn't been previously known and that prove things that before we said there's no archaeological evidence of this. So it may be that we yet find it, but the fact that it appears in literature at least is kind of like where there's smoke, there's fire sort of thing, that it probably did happen at some point.
For example, finding a corpse with chopped up ribs and floating lungs would definitely help. What we do know from research is that the blood eagle was more of an execution than an actual torture method.
Oh yeah, but a lot of these tortures are executions. Crucifixion is not a torture. You don't bring them down from the cross when it's over and let them walk away. It was a way of killing people.
Would have died long before he might have thought, damn, I look like a bird now. Check out our new store for cool Mitsi merch.
All right, well that was interesting, but it's part of history, and part of understanding history is understanding the cultures and the methods they used, not only for punishment but also for extracting information. The rack was heavily used in Henry VIII's day, but so was execution. And execution took a lot of different forms. It wasn't all beheading on Tower Hill. A lot of the people who perpetrated the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion, for example, ended up being hanged by the hundreds in some cases. So sometimes it's that simple. Hanging was still the main method of execution in medieval England, especially at Tyburn. You can go to this day on that part of London and see where the Tyburn tree was. So understanding torture and execution is to understand history, and it's a particular lens through which we can see it. So I hope you enjoyed that. Maybe that's the wrong word, but I hope you learned something from that. I certainly learned a few things. Let me know in the comment section below if there's another method that maybe should be added to this list. And I want to say thank you to Troy in Des Moines, Iowa, and Brandon in West Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you both for your support on Patreon. Couldn't do it without you. Thanks for watching.